Hi everyone, Johnny here, working on my film study skills, and today I'm looking at the 4 fights between Moreno and Deiveson Figueiredo. I like studying fights where it goes the distance because usually when fights go the distance, there are certain battlegrounds that will repeatedly pop out throughout each of the rounds. And look, I got 80 minutes of study time out of these 4 fights, and I'm really looking forward to taking you through a couple of the key battlegrounds that I sort of dissected throughout the 4 fights that these two guys had. The first battleground was obviously with them on their feet, with Moreno using his left lead jab in the orthodox stances. But the second key battleground was obviously in the grappling exchanges. Now we saw Moreno actually win the second fight with a rear naked choke, and part of that was off the scramble. And there was a couple of key things that I thought was really important about how the takedown sequences were formed, and there were some changes between each of the fights that both fighters had made adjustments. Part of the reason why I wanted to study these 4 fights is because when fighters meet for a second and third time, it gives them ample opportunity to actually make those adjustments to their strategy and to take into account what did they see in those initial interactions or that initial encounter with the other fighter. And it was interesting that Henry Cejudo, it was a big hoo-ha at the time about Henry Cejudo cornering Deiveson Figueiredo for their third fight, and obviously some of the strategic adjustments that he made for him to achieve the unanimous decision victory in that third fight.
So let's start with a look at the striking exchanges from the first fight at UFC 256. One of the first things I noticed when watching Moreno and Figueiredo fight was that Moreno would often circle to the close side, but when throwing his lead jab would push towards the open side. For those that may not be familiar with this terminology, I prefer to use the terms open and closed sides to denote moving towards the power or away from the power. And if you wanted to know the reasons why, check out my film study on Jared Brooks and Joshua Pasio for a deeper dive on movement strategy. As such, with the volume of this movement being utilised from Moreno, the question was then, how would Deiveson Figueiredo address this offensive action? When fighters stand in front of each other, we refer to this position as 50-50, as both fighters have the ability to land with equal opportunity. Sometimes, both fighters will land simultaneously. At others, the first one to strike will land. In this sequence, Figueiredo strikes first, landing a stiff jab. Because he does not exit, Moreno is able to push back into the open side with his own jab, and angle changes to reset the position as Figueiredo's counter just misses. Throughout their fight at UFC 256, Moreno would often be drifting backwards as he circled towards the close side. With Deiveson chasing rather than trying to cut Moreno off, the outcomes were often inconsistent, with both fighters finding success at different points. Here, Moreno layers his offense with his defense, pairing Deiveson's jab with his rear hand before utilizing his own. In this next example, Deiveson experiments with the extended frame as a deterrent, similar to a kickboxing style long guard. Unfortunately,
the more you fuck around, the more you're gonna find out.
That said, it was through the process of experimentation that both fighters would find things to take away for their subsequent fights. The impact of leg kicks throughout their 4 fights was definitely an important consideration for both fighters. Although correlation does not equal causation, the UFC stats do mirror the results from their fights if you take into account that without the point deduction in their first fight, Deiveson would have won based on the scorecards. In their first encounter, Deiveson found success with the low calf kick when Moreno would push towards the open side to jab. Here, Moreno changes direction to use his jab. As he pushes into the open side, Deiveson parries the jab with his rear hand and lands the low calf kick. With Moreno's wider boxing style stance, the low calf kick becomes difficult to check, as to transfer the most force into his punches, the lead leg needs to be planted. That said, planting the lead leg also allowed Moreno to try and counter with the rear overhand. It's also worth noting the frames from Deiveson on the return of the kick he would use to try and stop the jab from returning. It's these little adjustments made during a fight that can yield great insights for future clashes. For Moreno, it would be the effectiveness of the low kick and recognising that in the 50-50 he too can use it, as we saw in the subsequent fights. And for Deiveson, it was recognising the threat of the rear overhand comes from the extended lead hand, an adjustment that he made in their third encounter at UFC 270 to neutralise this counter from Moreno. It's probably worthwhile that I comment on the difference in movement strategy we saw in their third encounter, with Deiveson looking to circle to the close side, giving him a better angle to get around the shin and more effectively to the calf. This particular movement strategy mirrored Moreno's habit of circling to the close side, rounding the square and maintaining a true 50-50. Note the small rear hand parry as Deiveson lands solid on the calf. Another small thing I noticed in their third encounter was that Deiveson adjusted his positioning prior to throwing the low kick. It's a subtle difference, but one which allowed him a better angle to knock Moreno off balance. Take a look at these sequences from their first and third fights. Note how prior to initiating, Deiveson has lined up their lead feet in the third fight, as opposed to being more square with each other in the first fight. This small detail changes the angle of contact and also the angle of disengagement. If we take another look at the sequence, we can also see the revised left-hand placement of Deiveson in anticipation of Moreno's rear overhand counter that came out in their first fight. It's fairly obvious the impact that leg kicks can have as the fight wears on.
What was the problem?
I broke my
Leg.
What do you mean by that? You broke
Leg.
is broken.
However, one thing that separates the best from the rest is the ability to make adjustments in the heat of the moment. In this sequence, Moreno realised that Deiveson was keeping the left hand high to prevent the rear overhand counter to the leg kick. As such, he makes an adjustment to go to the body. There are so many leg kick sequences, it would be repetitive to include all of these in this fight study. However, Fight 3 from UFC 270 is the one you want to watch if you wanted to do a deep dive and study this fight for yourself. That said, there was one other variable that I thought would be a nice way to round off our study of the striking components of this quadrilogy, and this was from Deiveson switching into Southpaw to make it an open stance battle. In Moreno vs Figueiredo 1, Deiveson found success by switching into the Southpaw stance to give Moreno a different look. In one of the first exchanges in the Southpaw stance, he caught Moreno off guard with the left high kick. Part of the reason why the switch to Southpaw was effective for Deiveson was the newfound opportunity to play the lead hand fight, which he couldn't do in conventional stance. Here, Deiveson touches Moreno's lead hand before firing the left round kick to the body. I found this next sequence to be a thing of beauty, with Deiveson stalking Moreno in the Southpaw stance. Pay attention to the rhythm of his right hand probing forward, as on the second beat Moreno was looking to meet the lead hand touch, but Deiveson instead fires the left leg off beat, catching Moreno with a solid hit before Moreno chases Deiveson down, not wanting to lose the exchange, and lands a high kick of his own. Although Moreno was managing to block a lot of the body kicks with his arms, the damage was still being done without much coming back in the way of counters. As such, Moreno definitely addressed this with his team heading into their subsequent fights, looking to punish Deiveson every time he switched into Southpaw and deter him from staying in Southpaw long enough for him to launch the rear left round kick. I wonder if Brandon Moreno is a fan of Mortal Kombat because his spinning heel kick to the leg reminded me of the sweep from the games that they referenced in the recent movie.
Real cute. See you try down again. That's the only move you know, mate.
Deiveson proved to be a little more savvy than Kano, but this was an interesting weapon that could catch a lot of people off guard. Another more conventional example of how Moreno would attack Deiveson's southpaw stance was from throwing his own rear kicks to either the lower leg or the head of Deiveson Figueiredo. In the first example, note the tempo of the lead hand fight and how Moreno throws the kick off beat, shifting Deiveson off balance. In the second example, Moreno replaces the second beat of the hand touch with the rear high kick. There's plenty more striking to review across the 4 fights, however let's now switch our focus to the grappling exchanges between Moreno and Figueiredo. One of the things I enjoyed from their first encounter was Moreno's takedown sequences using Kasodogari in conjunction with the body lock, a sequence he landed 4 times at UFC 256. Turning Figueiredo's forward pressure against him, Moreno was quick to pummel his underhooks in, and through aggressive head positioning, forward momentum, and good hip-to-hip contact, he would break Deiveson's posture whilst hooking the leg to then break his balance. This sequence, Deiveson backs Moreno up with a shifting right cross, stepping forward with a jab before landing a solid body shot and framing to land another heavy cross. Moreno, feeling the danger, level changes to take away the space Figueiredo needs to strike and clasps his hand together for the body lock. With solid hip-to-hip contact, Moreno folds Deiveson's posture and completes the takedown with the outside leg hook. At their second encounter at UFC 263, I thought Deiveson might have found an answer to Moreno's body lock and Kasodogari takedown with the Ouichigari or large inner root throw, as where Moreno has Kasodogari, Deiveson could use the Ouichigari to secure his own takedown from the same position. Take note of the reaping leg and you will notice that although Deiveson completes the takedown, Moreno had the left underhook or the head position to drive forward, he may also have completed the Kasodogari on Deiveson. That said, UFC 263 was Moreno's night, with his tenacity in the scrambles allowing him to secure a decisive victory after utilising the same sequence again in the 3rd round to force the takedown. Figueiredo, not wanting to land on his back, went to 4-point and unfortunately gave up his back to an unrelenting Brandon Moreno. Their 3rd encounter at UFC 270 showed touches of the takedown sequences we saw in the first 2 fights, with a notable mention of Deiveson's awareness to Moreno's back attacks. This scramble in the 2nd round as Moreno caught the spinning heel kick was a beautiful sequence, with Deiveson rolling from turtle to scramble back to his feet. In the 4th round, Deiveson attempted the Ouichigari from the over-under position. With Moreno able to use his own underhook, Deiveson was unable to secure the takedown, although he managed to drive Moreno to the cage and secure a rear body lock. Moreno did manage to land his body lock and Kasodogari takedown in the 5th round, However, it's in their fourth fight that things get interesting. Aside from the first takedown looking reminiscent of what we had seen previously, Deiveson's defense when Moreno had secured the double underhook position had evolved from what we had seen in prior fights. By applying pressure to the elbows to prevent Moreno's hands from locking together, checking the hips to prevent hip-to-hip contact, and then looking to address the head position, Moreno recognised that although he had double underhooks, he would not be able to complete the takedown, and as such, opted to strike with an elbow on the break instead. Here's another example as Deiveson pushes forward to clinch, and one more example where Deiveson initiated the clinch, but both fighters checked the hips, preventing upper body contact. Moreno seemed more prepared to strike on the break as he drove the knee through the middle and a left hand over the top. Understanding that the clinching style throws were being addressed by preventing upper body contact, Moreno found success through chasing the lower body takedowns. At the end of round 1, Moreno shot a beautiful double leg takedown with his back against the cage, collecting the legs as Figueiredo tried to sprawl. In round 2, Moreno completed a single leg takedown that kept the threat of the takedowns imminent and allowed him to really open up with his striking, which ultimately closed out this amazing quadrilogy between Brandon Moreno and Deiveson Figueiredo.
As always, I hope you've enjoyed this film study. If you've enjoyed it, please like, follow, subscribe, whatever you want to do, and join me as I continue to work on my film study skills. Thanks for watching.